The mist rolled in quicker than I'd expected, but I didn't mind. I loved the fog, loved the way it muted everything, softened the edges of the world, made it all feel a little more mysterious. It was perfect for my project. Whispers of the Wild was going to be my best work yet. I could feel it after everything I'd been through in the past year. Hell, in the past month. This was the reset I needed. Just me, my camera, and the Smoky Mountains. No one to answer to, no one to lean on. Just the way I liked it. I hefted my backpack higher on my shoulders and adjusted my camera strap. The trail was rough, more overgrown than I'd expected, but that was part of the draw. The more remote the location, the better the shot. No tourists ruining the landscape with their neon jackets or loud conversations, just untouched wilderness. But untouched wilderness had its downsides. My camera had been acting up since I'd arrived. I'd missed some great shots because of it. Fog rolling over the peaks, a hawk perched on a branch just feet away. But I told myself I didn't care. This trip wasn't about getting everything right. It was about getting away. I paused to catch my breath and set the camera down on a fallen log. The lens fogged up almost instantly in the damp air, and when I wiped it off with the corner of my jacket, I realized I'd smeared dirt across it. Typical. "Come on," I muttered, digging into my bag for a lens cloth. As I crouched there, rubbing at the stubborn streak of mud, I heard it, a soft rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker. There were plenty of them around these parts, but it didn't sound right. Too slow, too steady. Tap, pause, tap, pause. I looked up, but the fog was thickening, swallowing the trees just a few yards ahead of me. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was just a branch knocking against a tree in the wind. I wasn't scared of being out here alone. In fact, I preferred it. No one to distract me, no one to get in my head. Still, the silence that followed felt too quiet, like something was waiting. I shoved the lens cloth back into my pack and stood up, forcing myself to move on. I had a campsite to reach before dark, and I wasn't about to get spooked by a weird noise, at least not this early in the trip. The fog never really lifted by the time I reached the clearing where I planned to camp. It was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. I set up my tent quickly, more out of habit than anything else, though I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I wasn't sure why. There was no one around, no animals scurrying through the underbrush, not even a bird call to break the stillness. I figured a good night's sleep would shake off the nerves. I was just tired. The last few months had been brutal, breaking up with Paul, the constant fights before it, the way he made me feel like I couldn't do anything right. This trip was supposed to be my way of proving him wrong, proving to myself that I didn't need him, that I didn't need anyone. But the anxiety crept up on me anyway, a tight knot in my chest as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of my tent. Then there was that tapping again, faint and far off. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, just the wind, just the forest. But then it stopped abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch, and I heard something else. Something worse, a whisper. It was so faint I could barely make it out, but it was there, threading through the fog outside. It didn't sound like words, not exactly, but it was too rhythmic to be wind, too deliberate. I sat up, listening hard, my heart racing. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it through the thin walls of the tent. Just mist and shadows. The whispering stopped, but the silence that followed felt alive, thick with something I couldn't name. I switched off the light, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I just wanted to get moving. The fog had lifted slightly, but the forest felt wrong somehow, like it was holding its breath. I didn't like it. I wanted to get to higher ground, get some better shots, and move on. By midday, I'd made it to a rocky ridge that overlooked a valley. It was beautiful. Exactly the kind of shot I'd come for. The fog clung to the trees below, creating a sea of white with the mountain peaks poking through like islands. I snapped a few photos, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. When I reviewed the pictures on my camera, my breath caught in my throat. There were figures in the fog. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just shadows cast by the trees. But the more I zoomed in, the clearer they became. Tall, thin shapes, barely visible, but definitely there, human or something like it, standing motionless among the trees, watching me. I whipped my head around, scanning the valley below. There was no one, just mist and trees. But in the photos, the figures were there. I lowered the camera, heart pounding. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have. And yet, the air around me felt suddenly cold. Not the kind of cold that comes with a change in the weather. This was different, deeper, like it had seeped into my bones. I should have left right then, packed up, and headed back to the main trail. But I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping me here, pulling me deeper into the wilderness. That night, I camped by a small stream. I hadn't seen any more figures, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. I felt like I was being watched constantly. Every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I built a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and tried to distract myself by reviewing the day's photos. That's when I noticed something else. The figures in the fog weren't in just one picture. They were in all of them. Some barely visible, others clearer, standing in groups or alone. Always watching. Always there. My hands started shaking and I nearly dropped the camera. It was impossible. I'd been out there for hours and I hadn't seen anyone. Not a single hiker, no animals, no birds. But there they were in every shot. Suddenly the whispering started again. It was louder this time, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The beam of light cut through the mist, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the whispering grew louder, like it was circling me, coming from all directions at once. "You shouldn't be here." That's what it sounded like. A woman's voice, soft but firm, blending with the rustling leaves and flowing water. It wasn't clear, not exactly, but the meaning was clear. I wasn't welcome. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest, and back toward the tent. The whispering followed me, growing sharper, angrier. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, I saw her. She stood at the edge of the trees, tall and thin, dressed in old, ragged clothes. Her face was pale, hollow-eyed, and filled with sorrow. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. The flashlight flickered back to life, and the whispering stopped. I didn't sleep that night. By the time dawn broke, I knew I had to leave. This wasn't some trick of the mind. No matter how much I'd tried to rationalize it, there was something in these woods, something angry, and I had trespassed. I packed up my gear in record time and set off toward the trailhead. But the forest seemed different now, like the trees were closing in on me. The path I'd taken to get here was gone, swallowed by the fog. My compass spun wildly, useless, and the map was no help in the unmarked wilderness. Panic gnawed at my insides as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to keep my bearings. But the more I walked, the more lost I became. And all the while, I could feel her watching, waiting. The whispering started again as I crossed a small clearing, louder this time, angrier. I dropped my pack, desperate, and spun around. There she was, standing in the mist, her eyes locked on mine. I fell to my knees, breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though my voice was barely audible over the growing wind. I didn't mean to. Her expression softened just slightly, and for the first time, I felt something other than fear. She wasn't just angry. She was in pain. "I'm sorry," I repeated louder this time. "I shouldn't be here. I didn't know." The wind died down. The whispering faded, and slowly the figure in the mist began to dissolve, melting back into the fog. I sat there for what felt like hours, heart racing, too afraid to move. But she was gone. The air felt lighter, the forest less oppressive. When I finally stood, I saw it, small, barely visible in the fog, a stone, hidden among the trees. A grave, long forgotten, buried deep in the wilderness. I didn't touch it. I didn't even get close. I just stood there for a moment, paying my respects to the spirit I'd disturbed. Then, without looking back, I turned and walked away. I made it out of the Smokies that day, but the images, the figures in the fog, the woman's sorrowful eyes followed me. I never published the photos from that trip. Some things I realized weren't meant to be captured. Some things were meant to be left alone. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, enjoying the silence for hours, but now something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life, birds, insects, something. But the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV, where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique one I'd brought along to mess around with during my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing. Until now. I stood up from the fire, walking over to the RV and ducking inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it, a voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment, then the numbers started again, 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere. Maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing, I was sure. But the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong, like the message wasn't for just anyone, like it was for me. I shut the radio off, my fingers trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods, the towering pines looming overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, made me uneasy. I stepped back outside, trying to push the growing sense of unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weathered jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. I heard it too. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal. The numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. "You've heard it too?" The man nodded. "I'm Ben," he said, stepping closer. His voice was low. I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. My cell phone drained to 0 in minutes. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What do you think it is?" Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. "I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer." I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals. Glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, Tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 137. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes were constantly scanning the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. You think it's some kind of broadcast? I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. I don't think it's a broadcast at all. What do you mean? He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. I think it's a warning or a signal from something out there. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask more, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. Then, through the radio, a voice crackled to life. We see you. My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. What the hell was that? He whispered. I could barely whisper back, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. We see you. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical. We see you. I stood up, flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy like the atmosphere itself was alive. I think we should leave, Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once, I agreed. The next morning, I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no note. Just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles, the battery draining faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 137. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected. An old, dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small glowing device, pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, all crashed into me at once in an unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower, as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, as if something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. The lights followed me, the clicking never far behind. But I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper. Even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror, it didn't stop. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 137. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am. And it's not done with me yet. We thought we knew the Ozarks. Matt swore up and down that Mark Twain National Forest was a hidden gem. Untouched trails, beautiful vistas, perfect for a 3-day backpacking trip. He was always good at selling these kinds of trips, making it seem like a dream adventure. I believed him mostly because I loved him, but even then, as we parked the car at the trailhead and unloaded our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was going to be different. Looks like we're in for some real wilderness this time, Kyle said, flashing a grin. He was already making jokes about getting lost and being eaten by cryptids. Classic Kyle, always trying to lighten the mood. I laughed it off, but something about the dense trees and the isolation made the joke sit heavy in my chest. The forest felt too quiet, too vast. Matt, as usual, was all business. He was adjusting his pack, double-checking the map on his phone. "We'll follow the GPS for most of the way," he said, his voice filled with confidence. "Should be easy, just a couple of tough climbs, but nothing we can't handle." I glanced at Sarah, who was tightening the straps on her hiking boots. She was always the tough one, competitive, never backing down from a challenge. I liked that about her, but sometimes it felt like she had something to prove, especially when Matt was around. I couldn't tell if it was admiration or rivalry. "Let's get moving," Matt called, waving us on. "We've got a lot of ground to cover." The first day went as expected. We hiked deeper into the forest, leaving behind the marked trails and venturing into the heart of the wilderness. The trees were taller here, their branches heavy with green, creating a canopy that let in only slivers of sunlight. It felt like the forest was swallowing us whole, but Matt pressed on, oblivious to the creeping unease that gnawed at me. That night, we set up camp by a small stream. The air was cooler than I expected, a bite of cold that sank into my bones as the sun set. Kyle's tent had a broken pole, something he hadn't noticed until we tried setting it up. He laughed it off, saying he'd just sleep in Sarah's tent, but Matt's frustration was clear. "Next time, check your gear before we leave," Matt snapped, his voice tight. "Relax, man. It's just a tent pole," Kyle said, but the tension between them simmered. I was too tired to deal with their bickering, so I busied myself with starting the fire. Dana, my girlfriend, snapped photos as always, capturing the last glimmers of daylight filtered through the trees. She looked peaceful behind the camera, but I could tell she felt it too, that sense that something was off. That night, we heard the first howl. It was distant at first, almost like the wind moving through the trees, but then it came again, low and deep, rising into a chilling wail that made the hairs on my arm stand up. "What the hell was that?" Sarah muttered, her hand instinctively moving toward the hatchet strapped to her pack. Matt shrugged, trying to play it off. "Probably just a coyote or something. These woods are full of wildlife." But it didn't sound like any coyote I'd ever heard. I exchanged a glance with Dana, and she raised her eyebrows in that way she did when she didn't believe something. Kyle, of course, took the opportunity to joke. "Sounds like Bigfoot's out there. Or maybe the Ozark howler," he said, his voice teasing. "You guys know that one, right? Big hairy creature, glowing red eyes, hunts hikers for fun." "Knock it off," Matt said sharply. "It's just an animal. Get some sleep. We've got a long hike tomorrow." I tried to brush it off too, but lying in our tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig outside made my heart race. I must have drifted off at some point, but it was restless sleep. The next morning, Dana told me she'd seen something outside the tent, just for a second, but she was sure of it, red eyes. "I saw red eyes, Matt," she said softly. I laughed nervously, thinking she must have been half asleep. "Maybe it was just a trick of the light," I said, though even I didn't believe it. I hadn't told anyone about the dreams I'd had, the sensation of being watched, hunted, like we were intruding on something that didn't want us there. Day 2 was worse. The forest grew denser, the path less defined, and the GPS signal flickered in and out. At one point, we lost it completely. Matt insisted he could still navigate using the map, but the landscape wasn't matching up with anything. The trees felt wrong, closer somehow, like they were moving in on us. The air grew colder, and the silence pressed down like a weight. "We're lost," Sarah said flatly, glaring at Matt. "We're not lost," he snapped back. "I know where we are." But he didn't. None of us did. That night, we found claw marks on the trees, deep gouges, like something had raked through the bark with claws far larger than any animal should have. Dana's hands trembled as she took pictures, but Matt dismissed it. "Could be a bear," he said, though the unease in his voice was obvious. "That's not a bear," Kyle muttered, his earlier joking tone gone. He stared at the claw marks, his face pale. "This is messed up, man. Maybe we should turn back." "We're not turning back," Matt said, his voice rising. "We've come this far. We stick to the plan." The argument that followed was inevitable. Sarah sided with Kyle, saying we were unprepared and it wasn't worth the risk. Dana stayed quiet, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Matt, stubborn as ever, refused to admit we were in over our heads. We set up camp again that night, and the howling returned. This time it was closer, louder, the sound reverberating through the trees like something was circling us. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamt of those red eyes watching us from the darkness. In the morning, we found more signs, animal carcasses torn apart, strewn across the ground. Deer, mostly, their bodies mangled in ways that didn't make sense. No predator would kill like that, not for food. It was like something had ripped them apart for fun. Kyle was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "It's the howler, man. I'm telling you, this place is messed up." Matt, as always, refused to believe it. "It's just a predator. Wolves, maybe." "There are no wolves in the Ozarks," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Not anymore." We kept moving, but the howls followed us. Louder, closer. By late afternoon, we knew we weren't alone. We were being hunted. It was just before dusk when we saw it. We stopped to rest, setting our packs down near a small clearing. That's when Dana froze, her camera slipping from her hands. "Matt," she whispered, "behind you." I turned just in time to see it step out of the trees, hulking, shadowy, with glowing red eyes that burned through the dim light. Its body was massive, covered in thick dark fur, but its shape was wrong, twisted, like something caught between animal and something more. The howl that followed was like nothing I'd ever heard, a deep, guttural sound that shook me to my core. It didn't charge. It didn't attack. It just stood there, watching, as if daring us to move. We didn't. "What the hell is that?" Kyle's voice was barely a whisper, his face drained of color. "It's not real," Matt muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Dana grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling now. The creature tilted its head, almost curious, its red eyes glowing brighter. Then, with one last bone-chilling howl, it slipped back into the trees. We didn't wait to see if it would return. We packed up in record time and started moving fast. Too fast. The light was fading, and we were stumbling over roots and rocks, our breath coming in short, panicked gasps. That night, we didn't set up camp. We just kept walking, desperate to put distance between us and whatever that thing was. The howls continued. Closer, always closer. When dawn finally broke, we stumbled upon an old ranger's cabin. Its roof caved in, the windows shattered. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. We collapsed inside, too exhausted to keep going. For the first time in hours, the howling stopped. Matt stared at the floor, his face pale, his hands shaking. "It's not real," he whispered over and over again, like a broken record. But we knew better. We had heard it, seen it. The Ozark howler was real, and it had let us live, for now. As we sat in that ruined cabin, the forest watching, waiting, I realized we hadn't escaped. Not really. The howler was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, and it was only a matter of time before it came back. It was still dark when I arrived at Devil's Tower. The silhouette of the monolith rose above the horizon like a jagged alien structure. The first light of dawn barely touched the sky, but the outline was unmistakable. This place had always felt otherworldly, as if it didn't belong to the same earth the rest of us walked on. I parked the RV in the farthest corner of the campground, vast away from the few other visitors scattered throughout the park. I wanted isolation. Needed it, actually, after months of losing myself in work and failing to fix my crumbling marriage. I thought this trip might offer me some clarity. If nothing else, I had my research to keep me focused. Legends of Devil's Tower had fascinated me for years, but one in particular always stuck out. The legend of the Watcher. Native tribes in the region spoke of a spirit that guarded the tower, a being that offered ancient knowledge to those who sought it, but demanded a steep price in return. As a history professor obsessed with ancient folklore, I couldn't resist the lure of that story. I had come to Wyoming to dig deeper into those legends, hoping to uncover something, anything, that might be hiding in the shadows of the tower. I stepped out of the RV, the crisp morning air biting at my skin. The towering spires of pine trees loomed around me, creating an unsettling sense of isolation. I unpacked my gear, set up camp, and grabbed my notebook. The plan was simple: hike around the base of the tower, take some notes, and maybe, just maybe, find something that would finally make all the pieces click. As I set out toward the trail that led to the tower, I passed an older man in a park ranger uniform, grizzled with deep lines etched into his face. His eyes were sharp, though, alert in a way that made me feel like he saw more than the average person. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "Morning," I replied, glancing briefly at his name tag. "Tom, you here for the sights or something else?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. I hesitated. "Research, mostly. I'm looking into some of the old Native American stories about the tower." He nodded slowly, his gaze flicking toward Devil's Tower. "The Watcher, huh?" I stopped. I hadn't mentioned that specific legend. He chuckled softly. "Everyone comes looking for something. But you do well to leave the Watcher alone, son. Some things don't like being disturbed." I tried to brush off his warning with a nervous laugh. "You don't really believe that, do you, Tom?" He didn't smile. "Doesn't matter what I believe. Just be careful. People who go digging too deep around here sometimes find more than they bargain for." With that, he turned and walked back toward the ranger station, leaving me standing there with a pit forming in my stomach. I told myself it was just local superstition, the kind of thing park rangers said to spook tourists. But as I turned my eyes back to the tower, the weight of his words lingered. By midday, I was deep into my hike, circling the base of the tower, taking notes on the surrounding landscape. The towering rock formation loomed overhead, casting long shadows over the forest below. I felt dwarfed by it, like a child standing at the feet of a giant. That's when I noticed the eyes. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a glimmer of sunlight catching on something in the trees. But then I saw them again, faint, glowing orbs between the branches. They were high up, too high to be an animal, and they followed my every movement. I stopped walking, my heart pounding. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just hovered there, watching. I wanted to dismiss them as some kind of wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind them, something intelligent. Forcing myself to continue, I kept walking, occasionally glancing over my shoulder to see if the eyes were still there. They were always just far enough away to keep me wondering, but close enough that I could feel their presence. When I finally made it back to camp, the unease hadn't left me. I sat by the RV, trying to write in my notebook, but my mind kept drifting back to the eyes and the trees, the way they'd followed me, never straying too far, but never coming closer either. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the campground in shadow. The tower loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the purple sky. The fire I'd started crackled weakly, the flames flickering as if they, too, were uncertain about staying here. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I was a rational man, after all, a professor, a skeptic. But as the night wore on, that skepticism started to feel more like denial. The wind rustled through the trees, and the fire guttered low. Then, just as the last light of the day faded, I heard it. A whistle. It started softly, almost like the wind, but it was too distinct, too deliberate, a single drawn-out note that drifted through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood, scanning the darkness. The fire cast faint light around the camp. "Hello?" I called, though I wasn't sure what I expected to hear in return. The whistle came again, sharper this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam into the trees, but there was nothing, no movement, just the oppressive stillness of the forest. The whistling stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I sat back down, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of the trees, made me bolt upright, expecting to see those glowing eyes or hear that eerie whistle again. I told myself it was just my imagination, just nerves from being out here alone. But the uneasy feeling stuck with me, settling deep in my bones. The next day, I set out again, hoping to shake the paranoia that had settled over me. I hadn't gone far when I ran into Julie, a solo traveler I'd briefly noticed the day before. She was standing at the edge of the trail, staring up at Devil's Tower, a strange look on her face. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said as I approached, though her tone didn't match her words. There was something off about the way she spoke, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. "Yeah," I replied. "I've been hiking around, looking into the old legends. You know about the Watcher?" She turned to me, a slow smile spreading across her face. "The Watcher? You're looking for it?" I nodded, uneasy. "It's just research." Julie's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. The watcher doesn't like to be found. You know, it watches, but it doesn't want to be seen. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about her was wrong. She seemed too calm, too knowing. The way she stared at me made my skin crawl. Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked back toward her campsite, leaving me standing there, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, the whistling returned, louder this time, persistent. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight, eyes darting between the trees. The whistle circled the campsite, moving closer than further away, like it was testing me, toying with me. Then, just beyond the flickering light of the fire, I saw him. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the woods. His face was pale, hollow-eyed, and his mouth was pursed as the tuneless whistle drifted from his lips. My throat tightened. "Who are you?" I asked. The figure didn't answer. He just stood there, whistling that same eerie note. My chest tightened with a sudden surge of panic. I stumbled back toward the RV, tripping over a rock and falling to the ground. When I looked up, he was gone. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me. The sound of my breath was too loud in the confined space. The next morning, I found footprints around the campsite, small indentations in the dirt, leading in circles around the fire. They hadn't been there before. On the final night, I couldn't take it anymore. The dreams of Devil's Tower had become unbearable, nightmares of the stone pulsing, breathing like a living thing. I dreamt of eyes, hundreds of them, watching me from the shadows, always watching. I had to go to the tower. I had to see it up close. I grabbed my gear and set out under the cover of darkness, the whistle guiding me, pulling me toward the monolith. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The stars above twisted and shifted, unfamiliar constellations blinking in and out of existence. As I neared the base of the tower, I saw her again. Julie, standing at the foot of the rock, her face pale and her smile too wide. "The watcher is waiting," she whispered. "It's always been waiting." The whistle grew louder, piercing through my thoughts, driving me forward. I reached the tower, my hands trembling as I touched the cold stone. And then, out of the shadows, the watcher appeared. It was a massive, shadowy figure, its body indistinguishable from the darkness, but its eyes glowing, burning orbs that stared into me, through me. It didn't speak with words, but its presence filled my mind, offering me ancient knowledge, secrets of the tower, of the universe, of myself. But the price. I could feel it gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The more I listened, the more I realized that accepting its offer would mean losing everything. My mind, my soul, everything that made me, me. I stumbled back, tearing myself away from the watcher's gaze. The whistle reached a fever pitch, and I ran. The ground beneath me shifted and warped as the world collapsed around me. I barely made it back to the RV. When I crossed the threshold, the whistling stopped. The forest fell silent. I drove away as the first light of dawn touched the sky. The image of the watcher's eyes burned into my mind. I knew I would never be the same. I've never been a superstitious man. Ghosts, spirits, curses, all of it felt like nonsense. My wife, Sarah, was the opposite. She loved all that mystical, spiritual stuff. She'd go on and on about how some places had energies, or how she could feel something otherworldly when we'd visit a new place. I used to tease her for it. I didn't mean anything by it. I just never took it seriously. Now, I wish I had. It's been almost a year since Sarah died. I still don't know how to talk about it. I don't talk about it, really. I just packed up the RV one day and decided to drive to get away from everything. Her voice, her smile, the way she used to look at me when I'd roll my eyes at her hippie nonsense. It was all too much to deal with, so I left. I wasn't running from her memory exactly. More like I was trying to outrun the guilt that came with it. Sarah always wanted to visit the desert, especially the Navajo Nation. She said Monument Valley was one of the most spiritual places in the world. I never took her. Work got in the way, or my cynicism did. Either way, it never happened. And now, with nothing but miles of empty road ahead of me, I found myself driving right into that part of the world. Maybe it was my way of making up for it. The landscape around me was beautiful in an eerie, desolate way. Massive red rocks rising out of the desert, mesas silhouetted against the setting sun. The kind of place that made you feel small, insignificant. I parked the RV in a remote spot off an unmarked dirt road. No other campers around, just the endless stretch of desert and the towering rock formations in the distance. It was quiet, peaceful even. I thought maybe I'd finally get a decent night's sleep. I stepped out and walked a bit around the RV, taking in the silence. The air was cool, the sky already darkening with the stars beginning to shimmer into view. Sarah would have loved it. As I sat by the small campfire I'd built, poking at the flames, I thought I heard something in the distance. A howl, maybe? Coyotes. I figured it was nothing unusual in a place like this, but the sound was strange, more like a scream than an animal call. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind. Still, it gnawed at me. Something about the isolation felt different tonight. Heavier. I tried to shake the feeling and headed back into the RV. I locked the door out of habit, but deep down, I knew a lock wouldn't help me feel safe. Not tonight. The first sign that something wasn't right came early the next morning. I'd been outside sipping my coffee and watching the sun rise over the desert when I noticed the tracks. Big, too big to be a coyote. Canine-like, sure, but the prints were deeper, more defined, and there were too many of them. They were circling the RV in a wide arc. I crouched down to get a closer look. The spacing was wrong, like whatever had made them had a stride far longer than any normal animal. I shook my head. Probably a wolf, I reasoned, even though they weren't supposed to roam this part of the desert, or maybe a large dog from a nearby ranch. Either way, I wasn't about to get spooked over some tracks. I spent the day hiking, taking in the massive rock formations and the endless red sands. The wind carried whispers through the valleys, but I ignored it. I refused to let my mind play tricks on me. This was supposed to be my reset, my chance to process everything and finally move on. But that night, as the firelight flickered in front of me, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. The coyotes started up again. At least I assumed they were coyotes. But the howls were different this time. Longer, more drawn out, closer. I told myself it was nothing. Tried to focus on the crackling fire, but the unease crept in anyway. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement on the ridge not far from the RV. A figure. Tall, humanoid, but wrong somehow. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like it didn't quite know how to walk. I blinked, and it was gone. Swallowed by the shadows. My heart raced. I stood, trying to peer into the darkness, but there was nothing out there. Just empty desert. The howl stopped, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. I doused the fire quickly and retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. I laughed at myself. A grown man terrified by shadows in the night. I was just exhausted, that was all. Grief and exhaustion made you see things that weren't there. I repeated that to myself as I crawled into bed. But I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me. The next morning, I found more tracks. This time, they weren't just around the RV. They led right up to the windows, pressed deep into the sand, circling the vehicle like a predator stalking its prey. I stared at them, unease curdling in my stomach. These prints were bigger than the ones from yesterday. Deeper, too. Something was out here. Something that was getting bolder. I decided to leave. That morning, I packed up my things, double-checked the tires on the RV, and set the GPS for the nearest town. But as soon as I hit the ignition, the engine sputtered. It wouldn't start. Come on, not now, I muttered, trying again. Nothing. I went outside to check the engine, hoping it was something simple. But when I popped the hood, everything looked fine. There was no reason for the RV to stall like this. Yet, there I was, stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no cell signal and no way to leave. As the day wore on, that strange feeling of being watched never left. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd catch sight of that figure again. But the desert was still dead quiet. That night, it came closer. I heard it long before I saw it. Footsteps outside the RV, soft at first, but growing heavier, more deliberate. Something was walking around, pacing as if deciding what to do next. I stayed perfectly still inside, listening as the footsteps circled the RV, stopping near the windows. Then came the scratching. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping against the side of the RV, but the sound was too methodical. It came in short bursts, like claws dragging across metal, testing the strength of the walls. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window, slowly pulling back the curtain just an inch. My breath caught in my throat. There, outside in the dark, was the figure I had seen on the ridge. But it was clearer now, standing in the moonlight, just feet from the RV. It wasn't human. At least not anymore. It looked like a man, but its limbs were wrong. Too long, too thin. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its face, it was shifting, contorting, flickering between the face of a man and that of a coyote. It stopped scratching and turned toward the window, as if it could sense me watching. Its eyes, yellow and gleaming, locked onto mine for a moment. Time seemed to freeze. Then it bared its teeth in a sickening grin. I staggered back, heart pounding in my chest, and stumbled toward the door. I had to get out, had to run. But as soon as my hand reached for the latch, I heard it. "Mark?" I froze. "Mark, it's me." The voice, it was Sarah's. Soft, familiar, and filled with the love I hadn't heard in almost a year. I turned slowly, staring at the window. The figure outside had disappeared, but the voice lingered, echoing in the night. "Mark, come outside, please." I shook my head, tears burning in my eyes. No, it couldn't be. It was impossible. Sarah was gone. She was gone. But the voice, it sounded so real. I pressed my hands to my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Mark, come to me." I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the scratching returned. More violent this time, as if the creature was trying to claw its way inside. But I didn't open the door. I didn't go outside. The next morning, everything was quiet. No scratches, no footsteps, no voice. I stepped outside, and the desert was calm again. The tracks erased by the wind. The RV started without a hitch. I drove away from Monument Valley, leaving the cursed land behind. But the memory of that night, the voice of my wife, the creature in the dark, has followed me ever since. Some things can't be explained. Some things, I realize now, should never be disturbed. I'm not sure why I chose the Ocala National Forest. It wasn't really on my radar until a couple of weeks ago. Maybe it's because Megan always talked about it, how beautiful the pine forests were, the springs. She was the nature person, not me. She practically begged me to take her camping here once, back when we were still together. I kept putting it off, using work as an excuse. Now here I am, in the middle of the forest alone in my RV, with nothing but my thoughts for company. I needed a break. That's what my doctor said. "Unplug," he told me. "You need to find yourself again," as if I ever had a real grasp of who I was to begin with. 2 weeks into my forced time off, I wasn't any closer to finding peace or clarity. I felt off. I didn't realize how addicted I was to being connected. No emails, no social media, no news feeds, just silence and isolation. It was what I thought I wanted. The first night in the RV wasn't too bad. I parked in a secluded spot far from the main road, surrounded by towering pine trees. I managed to set up camp without any major problems. I had a fire going, and for a little while, I could almost see the appeal Megan always talked about. There was something peaceful about the forest, about the stillness. But it was the kind of stillness that quickly became unsettling when you were alone. By the time the sun set, the silence had grown thick. The only sound was the wind shifting through the pine needles and, every so often, the distant call of an owl. I tried to read one of the survival books I'd brought, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to her. Megan. We hadn't spoken since the divorce went through. 3 years of marriage dissolved in less than a month. I couldn't even tell you exactly when things went wrong. I just buried myself in work. She begged me to slow down, to reconnect, but I didn't listen. I told myself I was doing it for us, that the stress was worth it in the end. But by the time I realized how much I'd lost, it was too late. The fire crackled as the temperature dropped. I got up to grab my jacket from inside the RV. That's when I first heard it, a soft tapping sound, like something lightly knocking against the side of the RV. I froze, listening. Tap, tap, tap. I leaned against the door, listening harder. The tapping continued, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, scanning the area around the RV. The light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Just trees and shadows. Probably just a branch in the wind, I muttered to myself, though the trees weren't close enough to the RV for that to make sense. I shut the door and locked it. The tapping had stopped, but I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I drifted off, I heard something. Footsteps, rustling things I couldn't explain away as easily as I wanted to. But when I looked outside, the forest was still. The next morning, I found the footprints. They were in the dirt around the RV, large and oddly spaced. Not animal tracks, but not quite human either. They seemed too long, too wide, like someone had been walking on the balls of their feet with unnatural precision. They circled the RV, stopping near the windows before disappearing into the trees. I crouched down to get a better look. The prints were deep, the kind that didn't come from a person casually walking. Whoever or whatever had made them was heavy, deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though there was no one around. I considered leaving, but I wasn't going to let some footprints freak me out. Besides, my RV wouldn't start. No matter how many times I turned the key, the engine just sputtered and clicked. The GPS on my phone was glitchy too, pointing me in all sorts of random directions before it finally went blank. Great, just great. I spent most of the day walking, trying to calm my nerves. I stuck to the trails at first, but as the hours passed, I wandered deeper into the forest. The pine trees stretched up endlessly, their trunks so straight and uniform that I started losing track of where I was. I didn't mind being lost, not at first. It distracted me from the unease that had settled in my chest. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone, standing just beyond the trees. I stopped dead, staring at the figure. It was tall, too tall, and unnaturally still. I blinked, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, but when I looked again, it was still there. A dark shape, humanoid but wrong, standing among the trees, watching me. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the forest. The figure didn't move. I took a step toward it, and in an instant, it vanished. Not like it walked away, just gone, like it was never there. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the spot where the figure had been, before I finally turned and hurried back toward the RV. That night, the tapping started again. Louder this time, more insistent. I lay in bed, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The rhythmic tapping echoed around the RV, coming from all sides. It sounded like someone or something was circling the vehicle, knocking at the walls, at the windows. I couldn't bring myself to move. Then the footsteps started. Heavy, deliberate thuds like boots crunching on gravel. They moved slowly, methodically, pacing back and forth outside the RV. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking, and crawled out of bed. "Stop it," I whispered to myself. "You're imagining things. It's nothing." But I wasn't imagining it. I peered through the window, and there it was, the figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. Its shape was clearer now, a tall, gaunt figure with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. I stumbled back from the window, heart racing. The tapping grew more frantic, the footsteps louder. My head spun with fear and confusion. What was it? Why was it here? I bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a voice. "David." I froze. It was Megan's voice, soft, familiar, and unmistakable. "David, come outside." My breath caught in my throat. "Megan?" I whispered, barely able to speak. "Come to me." I stared at the door, my hand trembling on the latch. The voice was so clear, so real, but Megan wasn't here. She couldn't be. It wasn't her. "David, please." The voice grew more insistent, more urgent, but something in the tone was wrong, off. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping and footsteps stopped all at once, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the forest felt different, lighter somehow. The figure was gone, and the RV started on the first try. I didn't waste any time. I packed up and drove away, leaving the forest behind as quickly as I could. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me, that maybe, just maybe, I didn't leave it behind. Some things can't be explained. Some things I realize now are better left undisturbed. I thought this trip would fix everything. I thought that a week out in the woods, just me and Tyler, would somehow repair the damage from the past year. The divorce hit him harder than it hit me, and that's saying something. I thought maybe, out here in the quiet, Away from the distractions of phones in the city, we could connect again. You know? Like fathers and sons are supposed to. But from the moment we hit the road, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Tyler barely looked up from his phone the entire drive, earbuds in, scrolling mindlessly. He didn't care about the scenery, didn't care that we were headed to Deadwood Creek, a place I used to go with my own dad when I was his age. It's funny how history repeats itself. My father and I never really saw eye to eye either. He'd brought me out here hoping to teach me how to be a man, how to survive in the wilderness, and now here I was, doing the same with Tyler, hoping the Black Hills would heal something in both of us. I glanced at him as we pulled into the campground. He didn't even notice the tall, dark pines surrounding us, swaying lightly in the wind. A dense fog had settled over the creek, and the sound of water trickling nearby was the only noise besides the RV's engine. It felt different than I remembered, more isolated, lonelier. "This is it," I said, more to myself than to Tyler. "Cool," he mumbled, still scrolling, not even looking up. I sighed, cutting the engine. After we set up camp, I suggested a short hike to check out the creek. Tyler grumbled, but followed me. The trail was just as I remembered, narrow, winding through the trees with the creek gurgling beside us. There was something peaceful about it, but also something off. The further we went, the heavier the air felt, like the forest was watching us. We reached the creek's edge, where the water ran fast over the rocks. I crouched down, letting the cool water run over my hand. "This place used to be full of miners back in the gold rush days," I said, trying to make conversation. "A lot of people came out here looking to strike it rich. Some of them didn't make it out." Tyler shrugged. "I guess," he said. I stood up and brushed off my hands, frustrated. "You know, you could try enjoying this." He looked up from his phone for the first time and scowled. "I didn't ask to come here." I bit my tongue, holding back the argument that wanted to burst out. "Let's head back to camp." As we turned to leave, something flickered in my peripheral vision. I stopped, squinting through the trees. There, just at the edge of the clearing, a dim light floated in the distance. It flickered like a lantern, swaying in the wind. "Did you see that?" I asked, pointing toward the trees. Tyler glanced up, following my gaze. "What? That light?" It was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Maybe I'd imagined it. The fog had thickened while we were by the creek, and the woods were growing darker. "Never mind. Let's go." The first night was when things started getting weird. Tyler and I had retreated to the RV after dinner. He was predictably glued to his phone, while I tried to read a book, but the quiet gnawed at me. The stillness outside felt oppressive rather than peaceful. The wind had picked up, and the pines swayed ominously against the backdrop of the night. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a soft, barely there sound, like whispers carried on the breeze. But as I listened, it grew more distinct. Not the wind. Voices. Faint, disembodied voices murmuring just outside the RV. "Did you hear that?" I asked, sitting up straighter. "What?" Tyler didn't even look up. "The voices outside!" Tyler pulled out one of his earbuds, frowning. "What are you talking about?" I stood up and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing but fog and trees. But I could still hear the whispers, just at the edge of hearing, like they were coming from the creek. I shook my head. Probably just the wind. Tyler rolled his eyes and went back to his phone, but something about those whispers unsettled me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, the air felt even heavier. Tyler was still distant, sulking around camp, so I suggested another hike, hoping it would clear the tension between us. He reluctantly agreed, and we set off down the trail again, heading back toward the creek. But this time, the unease I'd felt the day before was stronger. Every rustle in the trees, every crack of a branch set me on edge. As we walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was constant now, like eyes were following us from the shadows. Then I saw it again, the light. This time, it was brighter, flickering between the trees ahead of us, moving slowly, like a lantern being carried by an unseen hand. "There it is," I whispered, grabbing Tyler's arm. "Do you see it?" He stopped, frowning. What are you talking about?" The light flickered in and out, growing dimmer before vanishing completely. I took a step forward, but Tyler grabbed my arm. "Dad, let's just go back." I wanted to argue, but the look on his face, the fear in his eyes stopped me. Truth be told, I was scared too. "Yeah, let's go." That night, the footsteps started. It was late, maybe past midnight, and I just managed to drift off when I heard them. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching on the gravel outside the RV. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the steps were too heavy, too purposeful. I lay there, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps circled the RV. They stopped by the window, then moved to the door. Tyler stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake. I slipped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept toward the window, slowly pulling back the curtain. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, and there, just at the edge of the light, stood a figure. It was tall, dressed in ragged, old-fashioned clothes like something out of the Gold Rush era. A wide-brimmed hat covered most of its face, but I could see the gleam of a lantern hanging from its hand. The figure stood perfectly still, just watching the RV. I stumbled back, heart racing. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, but I couldn't find one. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the fog, the light of its lantern disappearing with it. The next day, Tyler was pale and jittery, his usual teenage indifference replaced with genuine fear. He hadn't seen the figure, but he'd heard the footsteps, and the look in his eyes told me he knew something was wrong. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "I know," I replied. "I'll start the RV. We'll head out." But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine sputtered, then went silent. I tried again and again, but the RV wouldn't start. "We're stuck here," I muttered, feeling the weight of dread settle over me. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. The figure was back, pacing around the RV, dragging something behind it. I could hear the heavy scrape of metal on gravel, like chains being dragged along the ground. "Dad, what is that?" Tyler whispered, his face pale with fear. I didn't have an answer. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped toward the door. "Stay inside," I told him. "No, don't go out there," he begged, grabbing my arm. But I couldn't just sit there, listening to the thing outside. I had to confront it. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. The figure was there, standing by the creek, its lantern casting an eerie glow over the water. It didn't move as I approached, just watched me with shadowed eyes. "What do you want?" I shouted, though my voice trembled. "What are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly lifted its arm, pointing to the ground near the water's edge. There, half buried in the mud, was an old, rusted gold pan. I didn't understand at first, but then it hit me. The legend, the miner's ghost protecting his lost fortune. I knelt down, my hands trembling, and lifted the pan from the mud. As soon as I touched it, the figure vanished. The footsteps stopped. The whispers and the wind fell silent. The air was lighter. The oppressive weight lifted. I stood there for a long time, holding the gold pan, my mind racing. Then, without looking back, I turned and went back to the RV. The next morning, the RV started without a hitch. We left Deadwood Creek behind, and neither of us spoke about what happened. But as we drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure watching us from the trees. I didn't, but I knew, deep down, that something had happened out there. Something I couldn't explain. Something I would never forget. And maybe, just maybe, Tyler and I would be okay. When you spend enough time alone, the silence becomes something else. It's no longer a backdrop, but a living, breathing thing that creeps in around the edges of your thoughts. I thought I liked the silence. That's why I had been living on the road for months, with no one but myself and my RV for company. But this trip to Ocala National Forest was supposed to be different. I needed to reset, to get my head straight. I guess that's what they all say before they lose it. The first day was easy enough. I set up camp on the edge of the forest, not far from one of the swamps that ran through Ocala. I had picked this spot on purpose, far enough from the touristy campgrounds, but close enough to the water to take some good photos. Photography had become my new hobby, something to fill the long stretches of time, something to keep my mind off Rachel. The forest was thick with towering pines and oaks, their branches twisting and closing in overhead. The light filtered through the leaves in a way that made the air seem heavy, almost suffocating, but it was peaceful. Or at least, I told myself it was. I parked the RV near a clearing, right where the swamp met the woods. The ground was firm enough, and I didn't think much of the water nearby. I had no reason to worry. Not yet. By the time I finished setting up, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing. The air was unnervingly still, like the whole forest was holding its breath. But I didn't mind. Solitude was the whole point. I sat outside for a while, watching the last of the light fade before retreating inside the RV. The hum of the small generator I had hooked up was the only sound breaking the silence. Everything seemed fine. Everything was fine, until the light started flickering. It was subtle at first, just a dimming of the overhead lights. I figured the wiring was faulty. Nothing I couldn't fix. I'm a mechanic by trade, after all. I ignored it, settling in with a book, trying to lose myself in the words. But then the flickering got worse. The lights flashed on and off in rapid succession. The shadows in the RV danced wildly before everything went dark. I sighed, more frustrated than anything, and grabbed my flashlight. After a few minutes of fumbling with the wires, I got the power back on. The lights stabilized, but there was something else. A soft buzzing noise, faint, just at the edge of hearing, like a distant hum. It might have been the swamp, maybe bugs, or just the generator straining, but it set me on edge. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, the unease I'd felt the night before was gone, replaced by a sense of calm. The sunlight was warm, and the swamp shimmered in the early light. I grabbed my camera and set out for a walk, looking for something worth capturing. Ocala was known for its beauty, the kind of untouched wilderness that's hard to find these days. But the deeper I walked into the woods, the more I realized something was off. It started small, little things I could have easily ignored. My compass acting up, the needle spinning lazily before settling in the wrong direction. The buzzing sound from the night before returned, louder now, seeming to come from all around me. I chalked it up to the swamp mosquitoes, maybe, or some malfunction with the generator still ringing in my ears. But when I came back to camp, I noticed the first real sign that something wasn't right. My gear, things I'd left on the picnic table outside, was scattered across the ground, not in a way that suggested wind either. The table had been cleared. My flashlight, the lantern, the tools I'd left out, all of them were scattered in a perfect line toward the swamp. I stopped, staring at the items. Someone had been here, or something. I'm not easily spooked, but my gut told me to get back inside, lock the doors. That night, I sat in the RV, every light on, clutching a lantern just in case the power flickered again. I told myself it was fine. Probably some animal. Bears get curious, right? But when the tapping started, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was soft at first, just a light tapping on the window, like something brushing against it. I glanced over, but didn't see anything. I convinced myself it was the wind, the branches moving in the breeze. But then the tapping came again and again. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The swamp smelled foul, like rot and decay, and the buzzing sound was back, louder than ever. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the clearing, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Large, human-like prints, leading right up to the window of my RV. The mud was fresh, still wet from the swamp, and the prints were clear. But there were no other signs of anyone around, no trails leading away. Just those prints, stopping right at the window. Then, nothing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to believe it was someone playing a prank, some camper messing with me. But I hadn't seen another soul since I got here. No cars at the trailhead, no signs of other campers nearby. I hurried back inside, locking the door, but I knew it wouldn't help. The feeling in my gut told me I was being watched. By the third day, I wanted out. I'd seen enough, but when I tried to start the RV, nothing happened. The engine clicked, but wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but the RV refused to start. Panic settled in. My phone had no signal, this deep in the forest, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. The buzzing sound was louder now, constant, like a low hum in the back of my skull. I packed a bag and decided to hike out. Staying another night was out of the question. The trail was familiar enough, but something was different. The air was thick, stifling, and the swamp seemed to have crept closer. I hadn't noticed it before, but the water was rising, soaking the ground around my campsite. The once dried trail was now a muddy mess, slowing me down as I tried to navigate through the trees. And then I saw them. At first, they were just shadows moving between the trees, barely visible in the corner of my eye. I stopped, trying to focus, but every time I turned to look, they were gone. My heart raced. I pushed forward faster now, but the shadows followed me. They stayed just out of sight, flickering in and out of existence, like ghosts. By the time I reached the halfway point, the whispers started. It wasn't loud, just a faint, distant murmur, but it was unmistakable. Voices speaking in a language I didn't understand, too quiet to make out the words. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the swamp, and those damn shadows. The trail blurred before my eyes, and I stumbled, my head swimming. I couldn't think straight. The buzzing, the whispers, it was too much. I needed to get out of here, but no matter which way I turned, the trail led me back to the swamp. It was like the forest was folding in on itself, trapping me in a maze of water and trees. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and then I saw them. Standing at the edge of the swamp, barely visible in the twilight, were the figures. They were tall, too tall to be human, with elongated limbs and dark faces. They didn't move. They just stood there watching me, their forms flickering in and out of the shadows like something half-formed, not fully real. I backed away, my heart pounding, but they didn't follow. They didn't need to. The buzzing sound grew louder, the whispers more insistent. I turned and ran, not caring where the trail led. I just needed to get away. When I finally collapsed back at the RV, drenched in sweat and mud, the sun was already setting. The swamp had crept even closer, the water now lapping at the edges of the clearing. I locked myself inside, every light on, but it didn't matter. I could still hear them. The whispers, the tapping, the buzzing. It all grew louder, closing in on me from every side. I knew what was out there. I'd seen it, and it was only a matter of time before it got in. I sat there in the dark, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the moment when the door would creak open, waiting for the shadows to finally step into the light. I don't know how long I sat there, hours, days. The buzzing is in my head now, a constant hum I can't escape. The figures are closer. I can see them outside, just beyond the trees. Their eyes are glowing in the darkness. They're waiting for me, and I'm not sure how much longer I can resist. I should have known better than to trust an unmarked road. After years of travel writing, you'd think I'd have a sharper instinct for bad decisions. But there I was, driving deeper into Fort Pinchot National Forest, chasing a forgotten trail that was supposed to lead me to a ghost town no one could find anymore. Vanished off the map. The ranger at the visitor center had said with a grin, "People go looking for it and never see it again. It's like the road just swallows you up." He laughed, but I could see the glint in his eye. He loved spinning those kinds of tales for tourists. But I wasn't a tourist. I was a writer, damn it. I had an assignment to finish, and there was no room for ghost stories. I followed the narrow, crumbling logging road as it wound deeper into the trees. My RV rattled along, tires crunching over fallen branches and loose gravel. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for my rig, but I kept going. I'd done my research, and this was the right way, even if the forest seemed determined to reclaim the path. It had been a long day, and I was eager to set up camp and relax before exploring the area the next morning. The further I went, the thicker the trees grew, their branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the late afternoon sun. My GPS had long since lost signal, but I didn't need it. I was prepared. I had maps. I was confident I didn't get lost easily. But as I rounded the last bend in the road, something changed. The sky had been clear earlier, but a dense fog was rolling in now, thick and fast. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The road, which had been clear just moments ago, seemed to dissolve into a gray blur. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. Just up ahead, a small clearing appeared through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough room for me to park the RV. I didn't have many other options. I pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped outside. The fog clung to everything, making the air feel damp and cold. It shouldn't have been this cold, not in early fall. The chill crept into my bones, but I pushed it aside and started setting up camp. Something about the silence gnawed at me, though. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness in that damned fog. I finished my setup quickly, then retreated to the warmth of the RV. I wasn't nervous, but the quiet was getting under my skin. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, settled into the driver's seat, and pulled out my maps. I spread them across the dash, looking for my next move. The ghost town was supposed to be less than a mile away, hidden deep in the woods, down a trail that was barely marked. Tomorrow, I'd hike to it, get my pictures, take some notes, and be done with it. Easy. But something was off. The road I'd driven on wasn't showing up on the map anymore. I traced the route with my finger, confused. The road was here. I'd just come down it, but now on the map, it wasn't anywhere to be found. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the windshield at the fog-shrouded forest. The ranger's words echoed in my mind. Vanished off the map. I laughed softly to myself. It was a joke, a tall tale to scare off amateur hikers. Nothing more. Still, when I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I felt it again, that unsettling stillness. The fog was thicker now, curling around the RV like tendrils. I looked back toward the road I'd driven in on, but it wasn't there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stepped forward, peering into the mist. No road, just an unbroken line of trees. My stomach tightened. I walked a few more steps, hoping the road would reappear, but it didn't. The forest was dense, the trees close together. There was no sign of the path I had taken just hours earlier. It was as if it had been swallowed whole. I jogged back to the RV, heart racing now. I grabbed my flashlight and marched back to where the road should have been, sweeping the beam through the fog, but all I could see were trees, tall, dark, and oppressive. My breath fogged the air in front of me as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. The road couldn't just vanish. I hadn't gotten lost. I couldn't have. But when I turned back toward the RV, I felt it, that creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I swung the flashlight around, heart pounding, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the fog. A figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. "Hello." My voice cracked. I regretted speaking as soon as the word left my mouth. The fog swallowed my voice, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing. I backed toward the RV, my nerves on edge, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't about to let a little fog and a missing road freak me out, but something felt wrong. The rational part of my brain was trying to make sense of it. Fog could play tricks on your eyes, and maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere. That was all. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the next hour pacing the length of the RV, checking and rechecking my maps, trying to retrace my route in my head. Nothing made sense. The road had been there. I hadn't imagined it. By nightfall, the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few feet outside. The temperature had dropped even more, and I cranked up the RV's heater, wrapping myself in blankets. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, soft thuds like footsteps outside, and whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. It had to be the fog, I told myself. It was distorting sound, making me paranoid. But when I woke in the middle of the night, there were voices. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear them, faint, murmuring voices, coming from outside. I crawled to the front of the RV, heart hammering, and peered through the windshield. The figures were back. This time, there were more of them. Shadows in the fog, standing still, watching. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold, hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. I scrambled to turn on the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power. The RV was silent, cold, and dark. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I tried to stay calm, tried to think logically, but my heart was racing, my mind spiraling into panic. The road was gone, the figures were back, and now I was trapped here. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket and burst out of the RV. The cold hit me like a slab. I marched toward where the road had been, determined to find it, but the forest had shifted. The trees were closer now, the fog denser. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape stayed the same. It was as if I was walking in circles. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the RV. I could hear the voices again, closer now. They echoed through the fog, indistinct and ghostly. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows appeared again, closer this time, standing just beyond the beam of light. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving. The figures were out there, circling me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. The fog pressed against the windows, and the shadows loomed outside, never coming closer, but never leaving. Morning came, though I could barely tell. The fog hadn't lifted, and the road was still gone. I tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I turned the RV around, driving slowly back the way I had come. If the road was there, I couldn't see it. All I could do was follow the same path I'd taken before, hoping it would lead me out, but it didn't. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, a straight line through the fog, leading nowhere. And as I drove, I realized with sinking dread that I was still trapped. The road hadn't taken me anywhere. I was driving in circles, and the figures were still there, watching, waiting. They had me now. The vanishing road wasn't just a story. It was real, and I wasn't getting out. I thought a week alone in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest would be the perfect way to clear my head after everything that had happened. The divorce, leaving the military, and that nagging feeling I'd wasted years of my life. I figured some isolation would help me reset, so I packed up my RV, grabbed my gear, and drove deep into the heart of the forest. I should have known better when I first pulled into the campsite. I felt that familiar sense of calm I used to get on deployment. A kind of satisfaction that comes with being prepared for whatever the wilderness might throw at me. The Apache Sitgreaves is a vast, rugged place, and this far in, you don't see many other campers. That's why I picked it. No people, no distractions, just the forest, my RV, and my thoughts. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV at the edge of a tree line overlooking a deep ravine. The view was incredible. The trees spread out like a sea of green, with the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over the land. I spent the first day hiking, snapping a few photos of the landscape, and trying to relax. By nightfall, the temperature dropped sharply, but I welcomed the cold. It felt like the world was trying to numb me, erase the pain I'd been carrying since Rachel left. I lit a small fire, sat by it, and let the quiet settle in. That's what I wanted after all. But the silence felt different out here. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. The first night passed uneventfully, but something woke me around 3 a.m. I sat bolt upright, listening. There it was again, a sound just outside the RV. It wasn't the usual rustle of wildlife or the distant call of an owl. No, this was different. Slow, deliberate footsteps. At first, I thought maybe another camper had wandered into my area, but when I peered through the window, all I saw was blackness, the dense trees illuminated only by the faint moonlight. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately, sharp and biting. I swept the beam of light across the campsite, scanning the edges of the trees. The footsteps had stopped. Nothing moved. The fire had long since died out, leaving behind only a few glowing embers. No signs of anyone. I convinced myself it was probably just an animal and went back inside, locking the door behind me. But even as I lay back down, the hairs on the back of my neck stayed up, like I wasn't alone. By the second day, I was already starting to feel the isolation. The weather was turning colder than I'd expected, and to make matters worse, the RV's heater was acting up. It kept cutting out, leaving the inside freezing. At night, I spent hours trying to figure out what was wrong, but it was no use. I'd have to tough it out. I hiked out again that afternoon, looking for some distraction. The forest was beautiful, but in an unforgiving way. The trails were rough, and after a while, I veered off the main path, looking for more secluded spots to explore. I told myself it was for the photography, but really, I just wanted to be somewhere no one could find me. That's when I first saw the carvings. At first, I didn't even notice them. They were subtle, old, just faint marks on the trees. I stopped to take a break and caught sight of one right in front of me. A series of lines etched into the bark, almost like a symbol. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the grooves. It wasn't natural. Someone or something had put it there. As I moved on, I found more of them, scattered and in no particular pattern, but close enough to make me uneasy. They circled the area where I'd set up camp, like some kind of boundary. I shook off the strange feeling gnawing at my gut. This forest was old. People had been here long before me, carving symbols and marks for reasons long forgotten. Nothing to worry about. But I didn't stop worrying. That night, I woke up again, the same time as before, 3 a.m. The footsteps were back, closer this time. The sound was unmistakable, soft but deliberate, like someone walking slowly around the RV, testing the ground with each step. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps circled the RV, paused, then resumed. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for the flashlight, but hesitated. What if it wasn't a person? What if it was something else? The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. Then I heard the tapping. Soft, rhythmic taps on the windows. My mouth went dry. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The taps grew louder, more insistent, coming from all sides of the RV now. I forced myself to get up slowly and crept to the nearest window. My hands shook as I pulled the curtain back just a little. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness outside. Nothing. Just the forest and the shadows. But when I looked again, I saw it. A handprint pressed against the glass. Smudged and distorted, like someone or something had leaned in close. The print was too large to be human. Its fingers were long, unnaturally so, and the palm had an odd, warped shape to it. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. I don't know how long I stood there frozen, but the tapping eventually stopped. The air felt thick, like it was pushing down on me, suffocating me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my hunting knife, waiting for the footsteps to return. By the third day, I was ready to leave. I packed my gear and decided to head out early. Whatever had been out there the night before, I didn't want to find out. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but nothing. Dead. The frustration boiled over into panic. I was stranded. I grabbed my map and decided I'd have to hike out to the nearest ranger station, a few miles away. It wasn't ideal, but I couldn't stay here another night, not with whatever was out there. I set off down the trail, moving fast. The cold had seeped into my bones, but I pushed on, hoping to make it before dark. The forest felt different now. Darker, heavier. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow hiding something just out of sight. And the feeling of being watched, it never went away. About halfway to the station, I heard it again. Footsteps that weren't my own. I stopped, listening. My hand rested on the knife at my side. Then I heard a voice. It came from behind me, soft and distant. Liam. I froze. My blood ran cold. Liam, help me. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It was Rachel's voice, my ex-wife. But she wasn't here. She couldn't be here. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. Liam. Her voice again, closer this time. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My mind was playing tricks on me. I started walking again, faster this time, my eyes darting around, looking for any sign of movement. The voice followed me, calling my name over and over. I clenched my fists, trying to block it out, trying to focus on the trail. But then I saw it. Standing in the middle of the path, not 20 feet ahead. The figure was tall, too tall to be human. Its limbs were long and thin, draped in tattered rags that seemed to shift in the wind. Its face? There was no face. Just a void, a swirling mass of darkness where its features should have been. Its eyes, though. Its eyes were glowing, bright yellow, like two embers burning in the night. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I fumbled for my knife, holding it out in front of me, though I knew it wouldn't do any good. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no sense to it. This thing wasn't human. It wasn't natural. The Watcher, something from old Apache legends, stories I'd heard long ago, was real, and it had found me. The thing took a step forward, and I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. I don't remember much of the run. It was a blur of trees and shadows, the forest closing in on me as I tore through the underbrush, branches clawing at my clothes. The Watcher's eyes burned into my back. Somehow, I made it to the ranger station. I don't know how, but when I stumbled into the clearing and saw the small building, I nearly collapsed in relief. I burst through the door, breathless and shaking. The ranger inside looked up, startled, but I couldn't form the words to explain what had happened. I didn't need to. When I finally caught my breath, I told him everything. The footsteps, the handprints, the thing in the forest. He didn't believe me, of course. Why would he? He checked my RV later, saw the scratches and the smudged handprint, but still shrugged it off. Probably just a bear, he said. But I know better. As I sit here now, writing this down, I can still feel it. The watcher's eyes on me. It's waiting, watching, and it'll follow me no matter where I go. Some things you can't outrun. I came to Red River Gorge to find peace, or at least that's what I told myself. When you've lost everything, when your life's fallen apart, nature feels like the only refuge. The solitude, the silence, they're supposed to help you clear your mind, right? But if I'd known what waited for me in those woods, I might have stayed home. I parked my old Jeep at the trailhead, strapped on my pack, and set off. The first day was perfect. The crisp autumn air had the faint smell of wet leaves, and the colors, God, the colors were dazzling. I'm a photographer by trade now, trying to make a name for myself since leaving teaching. The leaves, in their fiery oranges and deep reds, made the perfect backdrop for my shots. It was the kind of beauty you could get lost in. I guess that's what I was hoping for. The trail was tough, though, harder than I expected. The steep climbs had my legs burning, and my pack felt heavier with every step. I could feel the camera bouncing against my back, reminding me why I was here. The plan was simple. A week alone in the wilderness. Just me, my gear, and enough food to get by. No distractions, no people, no Rachel. I shook the thought out of my head and kept walking, focusing on the landscape instead. The river was nearby, its faint gurgle a common soundtrack to the crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time the sun started to dip, I was more exhausted than I should have been. My muscles ached from the unfamiliar terrain, and blisters had already formed on my heels. I set up camp by the river. I'd brought an old tent that had seen better days, but I figured it would hold up fine for a week. The stove, a clearance sale special, was already giving me trouble. The flame flickered weakly, as if unsure of itself, and I ended up eating half-cooked noodles before giving up and settling into my sleeping bag. That first night, I didn't sleep well. At first, it was just the usual branches rustling, the wind whispering through the leaves. But around midnight, I heard something strange. It sounded like a voice, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees. I sat up, listening. It came again, too soft to make out words, but there was a rhythm to it, a cadence like speech. My heart began to pound. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe distant campers, but there had been no cars at the trailhead. I was alone out here. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day was harder. The trail was steep, and my legs were sore from the day before. The scenery was still breathtaking, but the deeper I went into the gorge, the more oppressive it felt. The trees grew closer together, their branches blocking out the sun, casting long shadows that made the woods seem darker than they should have been. It was around midday when I first saw it. I was setting up a shot of a rocky outcrop, the kind of thing that might make a good feature for my portfolio, when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It was that primal sensation, the one that tells you you're not alone. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, and there it was, just within the tree line, maybe 30 feet away. At first, I thought it was a person, someone tall and thin, wearing a long tattered coat, but something was off. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. "You're just seeing things," I muttered to myself. "It's nothing." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, clearer. I could almost make out words, but they were garbled, like someone trying to speak underwater. I lay in my tent, wide-eyed and tense, listening. The sound wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to swirl around the camp, circling me. I grabbed my flashlight, zipped open the tent, and shined the beam into the woods. There was nothing, just the trees, the river, the empty night. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry, my mouth frozen. I was too scared to make a sound, as if acknowledging it would make it real. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent fully and stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap. My breath came in sharp, visible puffs as I scanned the darkness. Then I saw the footprints. They were large, human-shaped and fresh, pressed into the damp earth around my tent. They hadn't been there before I went to bed. My heart raced as I knelt down to examine them. They circled my campsite as though someone or something had been watching me, walking around while I slept. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I backed away slowly, stumbling as I scrambled back into the tent and zipped it up as fast as I could. I huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The whispers continued, relentless, until dawn. By the third day, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept, and every step felt like agony. My legs were leaden, my pack seemed twice as heavy, and my mind was unraveling. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart into overdrive. I wanted to leave, but I was too far in now. It would take me days to hike back out, and the thought of turning around filled me with a strange sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but I felt the gorge itself didn't want me to leave. Like it was holding me here, drawing me deeper into its clutches. I kept walking, pushing through the exhaustion, trying to ignore the whispers that still echoed in my head. By midday, I found myself near the river again, at a small clearing. I decided to stop and rest, hoping the sight of the water might calm me. But as I sat there, staring at the rippling current, I saw something across the riverbank. The figure. It was standing on the opposite shore, half hidden by the trees. I could see it more clearly now. Tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long for its body. It wore tattered grayish rags that fluttered in the breeze, but its face was a blur, a smudge of darkness that seemed to shift and warp as I stared at it. My pulse quickened, and my breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I raised the lens, focused on the figure, and snapped the shutter. The moment I did, the figure flickered like static on an old TV. 1 second it was there, and the next, it wasn't. Gone. I lowered the camera, my hands trembling. My gut told me to leave, to get the hell out of here, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by fear. The whispers returned, louder now, almost angry. They filled the air around me, a cacophony of voices speaking over each other, too fast to understand. And then I felt it, a cold, sharp pressure on my shoulder, like fingers pressing into my skin. I screamed, scrambling to my feet and backing away from the riverbank. The coldness followed me, clinging to me like invisible hands, trying to pull me down. I ran blindly, recklessly, away from the water, away from the voices. I didn't stop until I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. The whispers had faded, but the cold lingered, sinking deep into my bones. I was shaking, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd just experienced. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat by my dying campfire, clutching my camera, my eyes darting nervously around the darkened woods. The whispers had returned, but they were softer now, distant. I knew I wasn't alone. The figure, the wraith as I'd come to call it, was out there, watching me, waiting for me. I tried to rationalize it, but there was no denying the truth anymore. This wasn't just my imagination. This wasn't a trick of the light or the wind playing games with my mind. There was something in these woods, something ancient, something angry. On the 5th day, I decided to leave. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking with nervous energy. I didn't care how long it took. I had to get out of this place. But the gorge had other plans. As I made my way back toward the trailhead, the path seemed to shift beneath my feet. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find the way out. Every turn brought me back to the same spot, the same trees, the same stretch of river. It was like the forest was folding in on itself, trapping me in a maze of endless woods. And then I saw it again. The wraith. It stood in the distance, half hidden by the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I raised my camera again, my only weapon, and snapped the shutter. The wraith flickered, its form distorting, but it didn't disappear. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its tattered clothes trailing behind it like smoke. The whispers grew louder, the air around me colder, thicker. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. The wraith didn't stop. It came closer and closer until it stood just feet away from me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Its face, a swirling mass of darkness, hovered inches from mine. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it spoke, You can't leave. When I woke up, I was lying on the riverbank, soaked to the bone. The wraith was gone, but the memory of its voice lingered in my mind, an echo that refused to fade. I don't know how I made it back to the trailhead. I don't remember the walk, the drive, or even packing up my gear. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never go back to Red River Gorge. Some places weren't meant to be explored. I bought the trailer last spring, secondhand, from a guy who was moving to Florida. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. That trailer was supposed to be my sanctuary. After the stress of the divorce and losing my job, I needed a break from everything. The thought of spending a few nights by myself, parked somewhere quiet, far from the chaos of my life, sounded like exactly what I needed. So, I headed to a place that had been calling to me ever since I'd heard about it, Lake Lanier. People talked about the lake in hushed tones around the campfire when I was younger. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed that entire towns had been drowned when they flooded the valley to create the lake in the 50s, cemeteries included. The dead, they said, were still down there, restless, under the water. I never paid much attention to the stories. Superstitious nonsense, I thought. But after everything I'd been through lately, the idea of driving to the lake and parking my trailer on a secluded shore was more appealing than ever. A fresh start, even if just for a few days. I found a spot at the edge of a small, isolated cove, far from any of the designated campgrounds or busy boat ramps. Just the quiet lap of water against the shore and the trees standing tall and silent. It was perfect, peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. I parked the trailer and set up camp, watching as the late afternoon sun shimmered on the surface of the lake. That first evening, I cracked open a beer and settled into my lawn chair facing the water. The silence was deep and soothing, almost too quiet. I could barely hear the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, birds singing, frogs croaking, just the faintest trickle of the water lapping against the shore. At first, it was comforting. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. But then, as dusk fell, the air started to feel heavy, as if something unseen had slipped into the space around me. I ignored it. Just nerves, I thought. I was stressed, burned out, and needed to relax. But even as the sun slipped below the horizon and the lake turned dark and still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the first night, I heard the sound. A soft splash, like someone wading through the shallows right outside my trailer. It was nearly midnight, and the fire had long since died out. I was tucked inside the trailer, half asleep, when I heard it again. Splash, then silence. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. Probably a fish, I told myself, or some animal come down for a drink. But it wasn't. The splash came again, and this time it was louder, more deliberate, as if someone was walking through the water slowly. I crept to the window and peeked out, my breath catching in my throat. The moon was bright enough to light the water, and for a second, I swore I saw a shape, something dark, standing in the shallows just a few feet from shore. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, like a person, but the figure was strange. Its head was too low, like it was hunched over, and its limbs looked wrong. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I stood frozen, heart racing, as I stared out at the still water. Nothing. Just the calm surface of the lake, as if nothing had been there at all. I didn't sleep much after that, tossing and turning, convinced it was just my imagination. I'd been through a lot lately. It was bound to mess with my head. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent the day fishing. Even though I didn't catch much, I kept telling myself I was just tired, that the isolation was getting to me. But then, when I walked back to the trailer in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. Footprints, small barefoot prints in the mud, leading from the water's edge up toward my trailer. They were small, like a child's. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself they were my own tracks from earlier. But I hadn't been barefoot, and they didn't look right. They crisscrossed each other, as if someone had wandered back and forth around and around before disappearing into the trees. I crouched down, running my fingers over the prints, a chill creeping up my spine. There was no one else out here, no one but me. I looked up at the lake, at the still, murky water. It seemed darker than before, as if the light couldn't quite reach beneath the surface. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light. Maybe an animal had left the prints, or maybe someone else had camped here before I arrived. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, the footsteps returned. I had just turned off the lights and settled into bed when I heard it. The soft, wet squelch of footsteps moving slowly around the trailer. My heart began to race. I grabbed the flashlight and the small hunting knife I had brought with me, inching toward the door. The footsteps stopped, just outside. I flicked on the light and threw open the door, shining the beam of the flashlight out into the night. Nothing, just the trees, the water, and the faint rustle of wind. But I knew I'd heard it. I wasn't imagining things. I'd heard footsteps circling the trailer. Bare footsteps, like someone creeping through the mud. I locked the door and stayed up for hours, listening. But there was nothing else that night, just silence. By the next morning, my nerves were shot. I drove into town to grab supplies and shake off the tension. While waiting at a local diner for my food, I overheard some locals talking about the lake, about the old towns that had been submerged when the dam was built, and about the cemeteries that hadn't been fully relocated before the waters rose. "The dead don't rest easy out there," one of the older men said, his voice low. "You spend too much time by the lake at night, and you'll start hearing them. You'll hear them call your name, luring you down to the water." I felt the cold sweat trickle down my back. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, never had. But the way the man spoke, as if he'd seen something, felt something, unnerved me. I left the diner and drove back to the lake, more on edge than before. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the dread returned. It was stronger now, more insistent, like something in the air had shifted. I sat by the fire, staring at the lake, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The water, dark and still, seemed to be hiding something beneath its surface. And then I heard it. A voice. Faint, almost indistinguishable from the breeze, but there, whispering my name. "Rick." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared out at the water, the fire crackling behind me, and the voice came again, soft and distant. "Rick." It wasn't just the wind, it was real. I stood up, backing away from the shore, my pulse racing. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the water, my hands trembling. That's when I saw them, figures, dark, pale shapes just below the surface of the water. They were small, human-shaped, but their faces were twisted and distorted, like they were drowning but frozen in place. The water around them rippled slightly, as if they were trying to reach for me, but they stayed submerged, watching. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared at the figures, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. I was losing it. I had to be. I turned and bolted back to the trailer, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife I'd grabbed. The footsteps came again that night, louder, more insistent, and the voice kept calling my name. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care how irrational it seemed or how crazy the story would sound when I got back home. I wasn't staying another night by that cursed lake. I packed up the trailer and tried to start the truck, dead. The battery was completely drained, even though I hadn't left anything running overnight. My hands shook as I tried again, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. It was as if the life had been sucked out of the vehicle. I was trapped. Panic surged through me as I tried to think. I could hike back to town, but it would take hours, and the thought of leaving the trailer and whatever safety it offered seemed like a death sentence. The water called to me, louder now, the whispers coming more frequently. They wanted me in the lake. I grabbed a set of tools from the back of the trailer, hoping to get the engine working again. As I worked, I felt eyes on me. I could sense them, the figures standing just at the water's edge, waiting. The temperature dropped, the air growing thick and cold as I frantically tried to get the battery to respond. Finally, after what felt like hours, the engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I jumped into the truck, threw it into gear, and peeled out of the campsite, the trailer jerking behind me. As I drove away, I glanced into the rearview mirror. They were there, standing at the edge of the lake, their pale, distorted faces watching me as I sped off into the night. I never went back to Lake Lanier. I haven't told anyone about what I saw or what happened, but even now, months later, when I lie awake at night in my own bed, far from the lake, I can still hear it. the faint sound of whispers calling my name. The darkness of the Wa National Forest stretched before me like an endless abyss. The trees, as ancient as the land itself, rose tall and imposing, blocking any light that might escape from the stars. This was the kind of place I used to love, complete isolation, pure, untouched nature. I was there to study the behavior of some rare owl species and take a few nighttime photographs. At least, that was the plan. At first, everything was as expected. I'd parked my trailer in a remote part of the forest, far from tourist trails and campgrounds. The silence that surrounded the area was reassuring. I was used to this kind of environment and loved the challenge of being completely alone, immersed in nature. But that night, the silence felt different. Thick, heavy. I finished setting up camp and prepared for a night of observation. The wind blew gently, and the leaves made that soft, soothing sound that always accompanied the beginning of a night in the forest. For some reason, though, I felt a slight sense of unease, as if something was watching me. I ignored it. I knew solitude could play tricks on the mind. I had always been a skeptic. I wasn't the type to fall for superstitions or local legends. I went into the trailer to adjust my equipment. I wanted to set up the cameras and recorders to capture sounds and images of the animals that, with luck, would appear around me. But the first sign that something was wrong came then. My cameras started malfunctioning. The display kept flickering, and the images came out distorted, as if something was interfering with the sensors. I looked at the cameras, confused. They were charged, working perfectly before I left home. I tried again, but the problem persisted. I thought it might be magnetic interference, some kind of atmospheric anomaly that could happen in more remote areas. I decided to step outside and check my phone's GPS. But to my surprise, it had no signal. Okay, I thought. It's not the end of the world. I'm in a remote area. It might just be a matter of finding a higher spot to get a signal. But as the night went on, things really started to get strange. I was outside adjusting the camera lens when I heard the first sound, a low, guttural noise echoing between the trees. It was hard to tell what it was, something deep in the forest. It sounded distant, but it was enough to put me on alert. I knew all kinds of wild animal sounds, but this wasn't familiar. I swept the darkness with my flashlight, trying to locate the source of the sound. But all I saw was the faint glow of trees and the light reflecting off the leaves. The wind seemed to have stopped suddenly, leaving the forest completely still. There wasn't even the sound of insects or owls. Absolute silence. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was wrong. I knew that sometimes nature could be like this. Predators could silence the environment, scaring off smaller animals. But even by predator standards, that silence was oppressive. I decided to head back to the trailer and wait until morning. Maybe it was just exhaustion talking, and the darkness made everything scarier than it really was. After all, I had spent the whole day exploring the place. I laid down on my bunk, trying to relax, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like a shadow. I couldn't shake it. Then I heard the sounds again. Footsteps. I knew the sound of animal footsteps well, but these were different. Heavy, long, with a deliberate drag. I got up slowly, my senses on high alert. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the door. Something was moving outside. With my heart racing, I carefully opened the trailer door, and the flashlight illuminated the ground around me. Claw marks. The ground was scratched, as if something large had passed through. I stood still for a moment, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It could have been a bear or a wolf, but the marks were deep, as if made by something strong enough to tear the bark off a tree with a single swipe. A slight pressure began building in my chest. I wasn't easily scared, but what was happening here was strange. Very strange. The next day, I drove to the nearest town. I needed fuel for the generator, and I also wanted to ask a local if they had seen any signs of bears or wolves in that part of the forest. I walked into a small grocery store and casually mentioned to the owner, an elderly man, about the marks and the strange silence from the night before. He suddenly grew serious. His dark eyes stared at me, and he said in a grave voice, "That's not a bear, son. That's the shadow of the Black Forest." Confused, I asked what he meant by that, and with a worried expression, he told the story of an ancient entity that wandered the forest on nights with a new moon. They say it feeds on travelers' fear, plays with them until it drags them into the darkness. No one who meets it comes back the same. He spoke of the shadow as something that couldn't be defeated, only avoided. I smiled a little, unnerved, thanked him, and returned to the trailer. Small-town superstitions, I thought. Maybe he just wanted to scare me, or perhaps he was exaggerating local legends. But deep down, something inside me felt uneasy. I decided to stay alert, but still rational. That night, the tension grew. The malfunctions with my equipment continued. The trailer's lights began flickering. The generator kept failing. And then I saw them. Shadows moving between the trees. Fast, but impossible to make out clearly. Something was out there. I stood up and walked to the window, flashlight pointed into the darkness. And that's when I saw it for the first time. The shadow. It was a tall, misshapen figure, almost humanoid, but its arms were long and grotesque, and its eyes glowed with a pale yellow light. It stood about 30 yards away, motionless, between the trees. I felt my blood turn to ice. It was completely still, watching me. The silence returned, heavier than ever. I froze, unable to move for a few seconds. When I blinked, it was gone. My rational mind began to crumble. This couldn't be real. I must have been tired. My mind was probably creating these things. But at the same time, my body knew something dangerous was out there, something I couldn't explain. The following hours were a blur of frustrated attempts to fix the situation. I tried restarting the trailer, adjusting the systems, but everything failed. The light flickered and went out. The wind, which had been still earlier, began to blow fiercely. But instead of easing the tension, the wind carried whispers, distant voices, as if the forest itself were trying to tell me something. But I couldn't understand. The shadow appeared again. This time, closer. Its eyes watching me from the edge of the flashlight's beam. It was getting closer, slowly, playing with me. Panic rose in my throat. It was surrounding me, feeding off my fear, just as the old man at the store had said. I tried to leave. I started the trailer's engine, but it died almost instantly. I had no choice but to face this thing. I grabbed an improvised torch and stepped outside, my hands trembling. I had no idea what to do, but I knew I had to try something. The shadow moved again, floating between the trees. My eyes couldn't focus on it for long, but I knew it was getting closer. It was as if it was wrapping me in its darkness, draining my sanity bit by bit. Then I remembered. The fear. It fed on fear. I needed to control it. I had to force my mind to work. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and tried to calm my breathing. The panic began to fade, slowly but surely. I opened my eyes and it was there, standing just a few feet away. But something had changed. It stopped. My controlled breathing, my slowing heartbeat, seemed to weaken it. The glow in its yellow eyes dimmed. I didn't know how, but it seemed to be working. With one last desperate attempt, I got back into the trailer and started the engine. It sputtered, choked, but then roared back to life. I hit the gas, the sound of the engine drowning out the whispers in the wind. In the rearview mirror, I saw the shadow slowly fading into the darkness. I left the forest that night without looking back. I didn't know what that thing was or how I had escaped. But I knew one thing. I would never return to that forest. The shadow of the Black Forest was real, and I was glad to still be alive to tell the tale. I should have known something was wrong the second I stepped out of the RV. The forest around me felt too still. The kind of stillness that makes you question whether the world itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But I brushed it off. I was in the middle of the Sawtooth National Forest, miles from any other campers or hikers. This was exactly what I wanted. Complete isolation. This place was going to make for the perfect series on my channel. Unmarked trails. I'd call it a deep dive into forgotten paths, places people were too afraid to explore. And this one, it had all the elements of a viral video. No one knew much about the unmarked trail I was hunting. Only vague rumors of hikers disappearing and whispered stories of something called the Collector. Something about that name intrigued me. I wasn't one to believe in folklore or ghost stories, but my audience loved them, and that's what mattered. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. I hiked, filmed B-roll footage, and narrated into my camera about the history of the area. The trail I was following wasn't exactly easy to find. I had to rely on a few tips from locals, a vague map sketched by a guide at a general store, and a lot of guesswork. But I found it, an overgrown path cutting into the forest, almost hidden by the surrounding brush. Perfect. This is it, I said into the camera, feeling the excitement bubble up. The forgotten trail. I spent that afternoon hiking along it, deeper into the wilderness than I'd planned. Time got away from me, but the sun was still up, casting golden light through the canopy. I knew I had to head back to camp soon, but the trail kept pulling me further. I wanted more footage, more content for the channel. By the time I returned to my RV, dusk was settling in. I set my gear down, sat by the fire I'd built earlier, and reviewed the footage. That's when I noticed it. In the background of one of my shots, there was something. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees. It was faint, barely visible, but definitely there. A tall, shadowy outline, watching me. I rewound the clip and zoomed in, but when I played it back again, the figure was gone. Just trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had been alone all day, hadn't I? It's nothing, I muttered to myself, shaking off the creeping unease. Probably a glitch in the camera, some kind of light distortion. I'd seen that before. But even as I tried to rationalize it, my eyes kept drifting back to the tree line, scanning for movement. Nothing. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me sit up in bed, ears straining, heart pounding. But the forest was quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves. Still, that feeling, the gnawing sensation of being watched, clung to me, even as the fire burned down to embers outside. The next morning, I pushed my nerves aside and geared up again. Today was the day I was going to push deeper into the trail. I was determined to find something, anything, that could give my channel the edge I was looking for. I packed my camera, drone, and enough supplies to last until nightfall. As I set off, something felt different. The forest had taken on an oppressive quality. The air was heavier, the light dimmer. The trail seemed to have changed too. The trees were growing closer together, the undergrowth thicker. Landmarks I thought I'd passed before were suddenly missing, or maybe I'd misremembered them. Either way, I felt more disoriented than I'd like to admit. But I pressed on. Several hours into the hike, my camera started malfunctioning. The battery, fully charged that morning, drained rapidly. The drone refused to take off. When I checked the footage I'd shot, static filled the screen, blurring everything. My frustration grew, but I wasn't about to quit. Not yet. That's when I saw it again. Ahead on the trail, the figure. It stood between two trees, far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough to feel its presence. Tall, impossibly tall, and still. My breath hitched as I fumbled for the camera, but by the time I raised it, the figure had vanished again. I stood frozen for a moment, my pulse racing. What the hell was that? I wasn't imagining things. There had been someone or something out there, but there was no sign of anyone now. No footprints, no rustling leaves, just silence. I should have turned back then. I should have packed up and left. But something deeper than curiosity kept me going. It was pride, maybe ego, the need to prove to myself that I wasn't just a YouTuber chasing shadows. I was a professional. I knew these woods. I pressed on, my mind racing with thoughts of how this footage, real or not, could be my breakthrough. I could see the thumbnails, the titles, the cursed collector trail captured on film. It would go viral, guaranteed. But as the hours dragged on, the trail seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone anymore. The sun, which should have been high in the sky, seemed to hang low, casting long shadows earlier than it should have. And then I heard the whispers. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the crunch of my boots on the dirt, but the deeper I went, the clearer they became. Voices, indistinct, like a conversation just out of earshot. I stopped, straining to listen. My heart thudded in my chest. Ryan. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but hearing my name sent a cold shiver down my spine. I spun around, scanning the forest, but there was no one. Just trees. And then there it was again. The figure, closer this time. It stood in the shadows, tall and unmoving, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I took a step back, my breath quickening. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. Ryan. The voice was clearer now, coming from the figure. My legs felt heavy, frozen in place as I stared, unable to look away. It didn't move, didn't approach. It just stood there, watching. I fumbled for my camera, hands shaking, but when I hit record, the screen flickered and went black. The battery was dead again. My phone, too, completely drained, though it had been fully charged that morning. Panic surged through me. I turned and bolted down the trail, half my feet pounding the dirt. But no matter how far I ran, the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The landscape twisted around me, trails splitting off in directions I hadn't seen before, paths looping back on themselves. I was trapped. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree, my head spinning. The whispers hadn't stopped. They circled around me now, growing louder, more insistent. Come deeper. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear that clouded my mind. I wasn't going to let this happen. I'd survived worse. I just needed to think, to get my bearings. But then I saw it. My camp. The RV. I stumbled forward, relief flooding through me as I reached the clearing. But something was wrong. The RV looked different, older, like it had been sitting there for years, weathered and decaying. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. I had only been gone a day, 2 at most, but the way the RV sagged, its windows cracked, and the rust that ate away at the metal, it felt like I'd been gone for much longer. Ryan. The voice was right behind me. I turned, and there it was. The collector. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its shadows stretching toward me, its eyes glowing brighter now, like embers in the dark. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Ryan, come with me. The collector's voice was a low whisper, soft and inviting, pulling at me, urging me to follow. It took a step forward, and I could feel its presence, heavy and cold, as though the very air around me had thickened. No, I choked out, my voice barely audible. The collector's eyes burned into me, its shadow growing longer, reaching out. I stumbled backward, finally breaking free of the paralysis that gripped me. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My legs burned as I sprinted into the trees, away from the RV, away from the trail. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and shifting as I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. The whispers followed me, echoing in my ears, growing louder and louder until they became a roar. But I kept running, pushing through the exhaustion, the fear, the disorientation. I didn't stop until the first light of dawn broke through the trees, and when I finally did, I realized I had made it out. The forest was still behind me, the whispers gone, the collector nowhere in sight. I was alive, but I didn't feel relief. Only emptiness. I left the Sawtooth National Forest that day, my RV abandoned where it had been claimed by the forest. I never posted the footage. There was nothing to show anyway, just static, shadows, and whispers. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the collector calling my name, waiting. I wasn't sure why I'd come back. Maybe it was the need for closure, a way to put everything behind me. It had been over a year since my wife Sarah passed away, and ever since, I'd been drifting through life, avoiding people, and dodging their well-meaning questions. When I was a park ranger, the forest had always been my sanctuary. And I thought maybe, just maybe, a trip back to the Cherokee National Forest would help clear my head. But as I parked my RV in a secluded spot deep in the forest, far away from the designated campsites, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was a mistake. The sun was setting, casting long shadows between the trees, and I watched the colors fade into darkness as I set up camp. The last time I'd been here was with Sarah, years ago, when life still made sense. Now it was just me, alone with my thoughts. I wanted the isolation. I needed the silence, or at least that's what I told myself. I sat by the fire, the crackle of the flames the only sound in the stillness of the forest. The night pressed in around me, thick and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. I stared into the fire, my mind drifting back to Sarah. I could almost hear her laugh, see her smile through the flickering flames. That's why I was here, to say goodbye, to finally let her go. I thought this place, our place, would help me find some peace. I was wrong. It started with a phone call. I'd turned my phone off the moment I arrived, didn't want any distractions, didn't need anyone bothering me. But as I sat there, staring into the flames, I heard it, the familiar sound of my phone ringing. I frowned, confused. I hadn't turned it back on. Slowly, I stood up and walked over to where I'd left it on the small table inside the RV. The screen was glowing, showing an unknown number. How was that possible? I had no signal out here, not this far from the nearest cell tower. Curiosity got the better of me. I answered the call. Hello? My voice was rougher than I expected, a little shaky at first. There was nothing but static, a low hum that buzzed in my ear. I was about to hang up when I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable. Dan. I froze. My blood turned to ice. It was Sarah's voice. Dan, it's me. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing to find some logical explanation. It had to be a prank, some sick joke. But the voice, it was hers. The way she said my name, that soft, familiar tone. Sarah, I whispered, barely able to get the word out. The static surged louder now, drowning out the voice. I called out again, but the line went dead. I stood there in the RV, staring at the phone in my hand, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. What the hell just happened? I checked the call log. Nothing. No record of the call. It was like it had never happened. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind. Grief does strange things to people. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I just wanted to hear her voice again so badly that my mind had created it. But as I sat back down by the fire, the unease gnawed at me. Something felt wrong. The night wore on, and the fire died down to embers. I retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. The quiet felt oppressive now, too heavy. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to forget the sound of her voice. Then the phone rang again. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my ears. The screen glowed in the dark, the same unknown number flashing across it. I hesitated this time, but eventually answered. Dan? The voice was clearer now, more distinct. It was Sarah, no doubt about it. Come to me. The line crackled, and for a moment, I swore I heard something else. A faint knocking sound, like someone tapping on the walls of the RV. I jumped out of bed and hurried to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing. Just the dense forest, silent and still. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to calm myself down. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to think rationally. There was no way Sarah could be calling me. She was gone. I knew that. I'd buried her. But the voice, it was so real. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the RV had me on edge. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. The next day, I tried to distract myself. I hiked some familiar trails, took in the beauty of the forest, and reminded myself why I loved this place. But the feeling of unease never left me. It lingered like a shadow, always just out of sight. That evening, as I sat by the fire again, my phone rang. I stared at it, dread pooling in my stomach. The same unknown number, the same impossible call. I let it ring, watching the screen until it finally stopped. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking maybe it was over. But then the RV shook. It was subtle at first, just a faint tremor, like something had bumped into it. I stood up, glancing around the campsite. No wind, no animals. Nothing that could have caused it. Then I heard the knocking again. Soft, deliberate, like someone tapping on the side of the RV. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but there was no one there, just the empty forest, silent as ever. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. It had to be an animal, a deer maybe. But as I turned back to the RV, I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the trees. It was too far to make out clearly, but it looked like a person. My heart skipped a beat. Hello? I called, my voice shaky. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, squinting into the darkness. The figure stepped back, disappearing into the trees. I ran after it, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Wait! But when I reached the spot where the figure had been, there was nothing. No tracks. No signs that anyone had been there at all. Just me and the towering trees, their branches twisting overhead like skeletal hands. I turned back, my head spinning. This couldn't be real. It had to be the grief, the isolation messing with me. Maybe I'd finally lost it. As I walked back to the RV, my phone rang again. I didn't want to answer it, but I couldn't stop myself. I picked it up, my hand trembling. Dan, I'm here. Come to me. The voice was so clear now, so real. It sounded like Sarah was right there with me, just out of reach. I miss you, she whispered. Come find me. My chest tightened. Tears stung my eyes. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe she was still out there, waiting for me. But I knew it wasn't her. It couldn't be. I slammed the phone down and ran into the RV, locking the door behind me. The knocking started again, louder this time, more insistent. Something wanted me to open that door. Something wanted me to follow. I sat there in the darkness, listening to the knocks, the whispers, my heart racing. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The following day, I packed up camp. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I needed to leave now. But the forest had other plans. As I drove through the winding forest roads, trying to make my way back to the main road, I realized something terrifying. I was lost. No matter which turn I took, I ended up back in the same place. The same trees, the same path. The forest was keeping me here. My phone rang again. I ignored it, but the knock came back, echoing through the RV, louder and louder, until I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, jumping out of the RV, screaming into the trees. "Leave me alone!" The forest answered with silence, and then the whispers returned. Sarah's voice rising on the wind, calling to me, luring me deeper into the trees. I didn't follow. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed the only thing I had left, my lighter. I built a fire bigger than any I'd made before, at the flames roaring into the sky. The knock stopped. The whispers faded. The forest was quiet again. But I knew, deep down, it wasn't over. I eventually found my way out, back to civilization, but I left the RV behind. I couldn't bring myself to take it with me. I knew what was waiting in those woods. I never went back to the Cherokee National Forest, and every night when the phone rings, I don't answer, because I know it's not her. People say the Appalachian forests are haunted. I'd heard the rumors, whispers of restless spirits and strange disappearances, but I'd never given them much thought. After years of debunking ghost stories as a journalist, I became the kind of person who trusted facts, not folklore. Still, I couldn't resist the pull of Pisgah National Forest. It was remote, beautiful, and full of forgotten places that no one cared to visit anymore. Perfect for the series I'd been working on for my blog, Ghost Towns of the Forgotten South. This was my passion now, traveling, exploring the lost corners of America, and turning those empty spaces into stories. This time, I was after an old settlement deep in the forest, one that most people in town wouldn't even talk about. There were no records of why it had been abandoned, just strange rumors of sickness and disappearances. But those stories were always embellished over time. People loved their spooky tales, and it was my job to sift the truth from the legend. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near the trailhead, not far from the ghost town, or what remained of it. I planned to spend a couple of nights out here, explore, take some pictures, and maybe talk to a few locals who might know more about its history. The air was crisp and cool as I stepped outside. The towering trees cast long shadows, making it feel later than it was. As I set up camp, I noticed how unnaturally quiet the forest was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I brushed it off. Deep forests always had a strange stillness about them. I'd been in enough of them to know that the real danger was tripping over a root, not some ghostly figure hiding behind the trees. That first night, I woke to a distant sound, like laughter. It was faint, barely a whisper on the wind. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. Could there be other campers out here? I doubted it. This part of the forest wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot. My phone was dead, but I'd recorded some video earlier in the day. I grabbed my camera and replayed the footage. There it was, faint, like a breeze blowing through, but unmistakable. Children's laughter. I pushed it out of my mind and went back to sleep. I had a lot of ground to cover tomorrow, and the last thing I needed was to let my imagination run wild. The next day, I set out to find the old settlement. It was slow going. Thick overgrowth and fading trails made navigation difficult. The map I had was basic, nothing more than a dotted line leading me deeper into the woods. The farther I went, the heavier the air felt, like the forest was closing in around me. But I kept going, determined to find this place. After about an hour, I noticed carvings, symbols strange and jagged, etched into the bark of the trees. They weren't any kind of writing I recognized, but they gave me an uneasy feeling. Maybe it was some old superstition, a way to ward off bad spirits. I took a few photos and kept moving. It was another hour before I finally found it. The ghost town was just as eerie as I'd imagined. Small, dilapidated cabins stood in clusters, some half collapsed under the weight of time and nature. Weeds and vines crept over everything, reclaiming the land. I walked through the empty streets, my camera clicking as I captured the desolation, the eerie stillness. That's when I saw the cemetery, Small, tucked away behind what must have been the church, though the building itself was nothing more than a few rotting beams. The graves were old, the names barely legible, but the dates caught my eye. Some of them were from decades ago, but others were from the future. My first instinct was that it had to be a mistake, some kind of misprint or vandalism, but the stones looked too old, too weathered to be recent. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped back from the graves. It didn't make sense, and I didn't like the feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. I realized then that I hadn't heard anything. Not birds, not insects, nothing since I'd arrived. I packed up my camera and headed back toward my RV. I'd gotten what I came for and figured I'd do some research on the strange gravestones when I got back to town. But something was wrong. The trail didn't look right. I was sure I'd come from this direction, but now the trees seemed different. The symbols I'd passed earlier weren't there anymore, and the forest seemed denser, more oppressive. My pulse quickened. I was lost. That was impossible. I never got lost, not with GPS and maps, not with all the preparation I'd done. I kept walking, trying to retrace my steps, but the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. Every turn led me to unfamiliar territory, and soon the forest looked completely foreign. My sense of time slipped away, and the sky started to darken, even though it felt like midday. Then I saw it, just ahead, through the trees. A figure stood on the trail, tall and motionless, watching me. I stopped cold, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding smaller than I'd intended. No response. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, squinting through the gloom, but as I did, it vanished, just gone. I spun around, scanning the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. My hands shook as I adjusted my pack. This was wrong. Everything was wrong. The sun had nearly set by the time I found my RV. It was parked where I left it, but somehow the journey back had taken hours longer than it should have. My legs were aching, my mind spinning with confusion. I climbed inside, locking the door behind me and collapsing onto the bed. That's when the laughter started again, louder this time, right outside the RV. I shot up, my heart pounding. I could hear them, children laughing and running around, their voices bouncing off the trees. I grabbed the camera, pointing it toward the window. But the moment I did, the laughter stopped. The forest was silent again, suffocating in its stillness. I played back the footage on the camera, hoping to catch something, anything, that would explain what was happening. But instead, I heard something else. A voice, clear as day, whispering my name. "Alex." I froze. The camera dropped from my hands and hit the floor with a thud, the sound echoing in the empty RV. Something was out there, and it knew my name. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed, every muscle tense, listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. I thought about leaving, driving out of the forest and abandoning the project altogether. But the RV wouldn't start. I tried the engine a dozen times, but it was dead. Dead as if the battery had drained overnight. My phone was useless, still dead from the day before. I was completely cut off. The next morning, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't stay here, not with whatever was out there watching me. I remembered the symbols on the trees, the strange carvings I'd seen on my hike. They had to mean something. Maybe they were the key to getting out of here. I grabbed my camping knife and headed back into the woods. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of dread. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep walking. I found the first symbol carved into the bark of a tree just off the trail. With a deep breath, I drove the blade into the wood, carving through the lines. As soon as the symbol was broken, the air shifted. The forest seemed to shudder, and for a moment, I thought I heard a scream. A distant echo and wail carried on the wind. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but I kept going. I found the next tree and did the same, cutting through the strange lines with my knife. The voices grew louder, the laughter, the whispers, all swirling around me like a storm. I could see the figures now, darting between the trees, shadowy, faceless figures watching, waiting. They wanted me to stop. They didn't want me to leave. But I wasn't going to be trapped here, not like them. I reached the final tree, my hands trembling as I raised the knife. The voices were deafening now, the figures closing in, but I didn't stop. With one last slash, I broke the symbol. And just like that, the voices stopped. The forest went still. The shadows vanished, and the oppressive weight that had hung over me lifted. I stumbled back toward my RV, half expecting the figures to reappear, but the woods were empty. When I got back, the engine started on the first try. I didn't look back as I drove out of the forest, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. I wasn't going to write about this place. I wasn't going to tell anyone what happened here. Some things are better left forgotten.